Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Orchard Cast. I'm your host, Jeremy Appel, coming to you, as always, from a slice of Treaty 6 territory you may know as Edmonton. Listeners to this podcast will likely already know that the Canadian media's coverage of the genocide in Gaza has been atrocious. There are various factors at play here: the concentration of Canadian media ownership, the ideological preferences of these owners, and the editors they install, dwindling amount of newsroom resources that goes increasingly towards almost uniformly right-wing commentary, lazy reporting, flack from pro-Israel organizations like Honest Reporting and CJA. But the Canadian media is small potatoes compared to the American press, which has an infinitesimally larger domestic and international reach. As the country actively funding, arming, and giving diplomatic cover to Israel, American public opinion has much higher stakes. American media critic Adam H. Johnson has a new book out, How to Sell a Genocide: The Media's Complicity in the Destruction of Gaza. The book engages in a thorough database dismantling of thousands of articles and video segments on the war in Gaza from the New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, The Atlantic, CNN, MSNBC, and others. It shouldn't surprise you to hear that the data demonstrates an overwhelming pro-Israel bias in liberal American media. Israelis are killed and Palestinians mysteriously die. Israeli claims are cited without question, and Palestinian claims are regarded as inherently suspect. And the country funding it all is portrayed as a neutral third-party observer that's powerless to stop their client. Johnson argues that this framing was crucial in getting Americans to look away from the unspeakable horrors being live streamed to them on their phones. He joins me momentarily to discuss his findings. But first, if you like the work I do here at The Orchard and have the means, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. It will allow me to continue doing this work. Don't just take my word for it. Here's what Orchard supporter Kathy Dupree's Kiss says. Jeremy Appel in The Orchard is a fantastic source of hard news, real journalism, boots on the ground stuff. The fact that he's from Edmonton just reinforces that he tells it like it is without having to be slotted into a left, right, woke BS polarization. Canada needs more of this type of reporting. You're making me blush, Kathy. Just one small fact check. I'm not from Edmonton. I'm actually from Ontario, but I do reside here. Anyways, on with the show. Adam Johnson, co-host of the Citations Needed podcast, and more importantly, for our purposes, author of How to Sell a Genocide. Thanks so much for joining me today, Adam.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, it's a really great book. It jogged my memory a lot of sort of what we've witnessed as journalists and media critics over the past almost 3 years now, in terms of these rationalizations for Israel's behavior in Gaza primarily, but also you see in Iran, the West Bank, Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, what have you. And I thought it was very well done. Most of the book focuses on the first year of the genocide, right?
Yes, the scope of the book is the first year, I'd say, with an emphasis on the first 3 to 6 months, with the basic argument that it was in those first few months that the genocide became inevitable. Certain decisions were made, certain high leverage position decisions, and ideological and narrative output were codified and cemented such that genocide was inevitable within the first few months, if not the first few weeks. And so that's why the emphasis is on the beginning of it, because once the so-called facts on the ground were established in terms of all the premises of genocide, so-called war on Hamas, the refusal to have engage in a ceasefire to kind of discredit ceasefires as a credible position, the complete exceptionalizing of Hamas as an actor that exists both outside of Palestine and outside of history, as someone you can't enter into a ceasefire with, and indeed the proposal of that was somehow offensive. Those kind of core premises, once they're cemented and codified in liberal, lowercase l, liberal media, institutions, and government, make what ended up happening, which is the mass killing, displacement, and genocide, to some extent attempted ethnic cleansing, although to a great extent successful ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, inevitable. So that's the argument, that there's critical moments. It's fundamentally a book about critical moments where U.S. media in particular, and of course this is not unique to U.S., which we can talk about, I know you're in Canada, really intervened and stepped in to defend the status quo, defend the genocide and violence, and then provide further justification for it when it mattered the most. And so that's why the focus is on the first few weeks. And of course, Biden being in the White House for the first 15 months makes it fundamentally a book about liberal institutions, liberal power, liberal logic and arguments, and ultimately lowercase l, liberal media, and its role in making this genocide bipartisan.
Right. And I wanted to talk to you about that because the book focuses on, again, for lack of a better term, liberal media, New York Times, The Atlantic, Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC. You don't talk about the Wall Street Journal or Fox News or One America or Talk Radio.
Newsmax, right?
Newsmax.
So the reason for that is important, because some people may ask that and ask why, and the answer is twofold. Number one, those institutions would not really deny that they're pro-genocide. They wouldn't phrase it like that, but they would say they're pro-Israel, like overtly. They don't make claims to universalism. They don't really make claims to humanitarianism or human rights. And if you accuse them of being pro-genocide, they would more or less say, yeah, so what? So it's not a very meaningful statement to criticize Fox News for being pro-Israel. It is a baseline reality that I don't think that's not really in dispute. Whereas so-called liberal or even centrist media does make lofty claims to universalism, makes lofty claims to caring about human rights, makes lofty claims to caring about humanitarianism and universalism, and therefore that is an intervention which is much more high leverage. It's much more dispositive with respect to whether or not there is a genocide, and because most people agree that the New York Times was critical in selling, for example, the Iraq War with its laundering of Bush administration propaganda with respect to aluminum tubes, or the editorial board supporting the Atlantic magazine was critical in selling the Iraq War, as was the New Yorker. That within the United States, there's kind of a baseline reptile brain racism and imperialism that's usually 35, 40% largely Republican. And you got to keep the juices flowing with Fox News, but you don't really have to convince a lot of people. Whereas to support a genocide, especially a bipartisan one, especially one where there's a Democrat in the White House, to get it to that 55, 60%, you need liberal media. Liberal media is, to use a baseball term, high leverage. It intervenes when it matters most, not so much in a kind of baseline promotion of pro-genocide imperialist propaganda. Although that, of course, is important. That baseline should not be taken for granted. It's just simply not the scope of this book. So it's not about liberal media somehow being more morally culpable than right wing media. I think they're equally culpable, but it is more of an interesting line of inquiry, a more novel and more contested line of inquiry, therefore requiring much greater argumentation, as I attempt to do. And so this is obviously much more acute because there was a Democrat in the White House, so liberal support was critical. And again, there was not really any dissent among Republicans, with the exception of the now deposed Congressman Massey of Kentucky's 4th District. But other than that, it was not really a contested space, and so that's why that's the focus. And I think there needed to be account of that. And if I say, especially because so much of the data is just summing up the consensus, if I lumped in liberal media with these more kind of cartoon right-wing tabloids, it would really muddy the data. It wouldn't really clarify much. So that's the reason.
And throughout the book, you sort of frame these moats of rationalization, as you call them. So what are moats of rationalization, and how did they provide this intellectual framework for defending genocide, or providing the appearance that this wasn't something the U.S. was actively participating in?
So the modes of rationalization is a framework where people rationalize what I think everyone understood to be indefensible, which is the mass slaughter of Palestinians, of effectively defenseless population, specifically 30% of whom were killed were children. 20,000 children for the first 2 years were killed. The number is almost certainly double that, but that's just the ones we know of. And that required rationalization to prevent the mass movement or kind of mass sentiment towards the U.S. imposing a ceasefire, which they very well could do, but very explicitly refused to do during the Biden White House. That 15 months that they were in charge of the genocide, or at least in charge of the U.S.'s support for it. And so what the moats of rationalization is they're kind of excuses we make to justify not stopping the thing that we were capable, we being the kind of general liberal left world, stopping the genocide that we kept arming and supporting. And so you have, first and foremost, it goes from right to center. So right says, yes, there's a genocide and it's good, right? That's kind of the Newsmax, Fox News, far right Zionist position. But then as you get closer to the center, you start to get these kind of more, what I would say more sophisticated and popular on cable news and print media arguments to justify not pressuring Biden into imposing a ceasefire, which he, again, unilaterally could whenever he wishes. The first one I would say maybe I think I argue is the most effective was this idea of, because again, after the first few weeks, very few people in liberal institutions bothered to defend the genocide or the so-called war on Hamas on first principles. They began to sort of try to move it into the realm of the non sequitur. And so the way you do that is you acknowledge the suffering, you acknowledge the carnage, you acknowledge the thousands of children being killed. But you say, actually, it's Hamas's fault because of human shield. So the first mode of rationalization is this Jake Tapper line about human shielding, that the mass carnage you're seeing is actually unfortunate, and it's all very sad, but it's actually part of a diabolical PR strategy from Hamas. Now, it's important.
You also saw Bono of U2 fame.
Well, of course, Bono. Yeah, well, he knows who butters his bread. So this was the popular line with David Leonard. It was popular with the New York Times. It was popular with NPR. What's important to understand is that no human rights group, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Oxfam, none of them support this definition of human shield, which is a guerrilla military actor in mere proximity to civilians. That's not what the term means under IHL, International Humanitarian Law. What it means is at gunpoint or strapping a bomb to someone, you force them to go clear out weapons or bombs, or you force them to block you from enemy fire in a combat zone. That's what the word human shields mean. It doesn't just mean a military actor in proximity to civilians. And we know that because the second the United States started bombing Iran in February of 2026, according to NBC News, they scattered their troops in civilian infrastructure throughout the Gulf, Kuwait, Emirati countries, Saudi, because they wanted to, quote, get them out of harm's way. They put them in civilian hotels and civilian office spaces. But of course, that was never called human shields. But that's precisely what they accuse Hamas of doing and other Palestinian militants. But that's not what the term means. And this idea of human shielding or human shields, right, where Palestinian militants are presented as exogenous or separate from Gaza, are presented as basically having one big hostage situation that the Israelis need to free them of, became this own internal canard that within U.S. media that had no support among humanitarian or human rights groups. It was simply a media concoction. It was a thingamajig. That was, I think, the first one that really was the first moat that people would sort of settle on when they'd say, well, this is bad. It's very sad. I feel upset about it. I cry about it every day. This kind of crocodile tears you got from liberal intelligentsia and pundits and reporters. But it's Hamas's fault because such and such human shield, and they refuse to, surrender or give back the hostages or other some such sort of pat expression, which are all just reasserting the logic of collective punishment, by the way. Whenever someone says this could end if Hamas gives up, whenever there's some horrific news of mass slaughter and they say, well, it would end if Hamas gave up the hostages or the captives, that's simply a reiteration of collective punishment as a logic. That's a war crime for a reason, because you can't punish civilians for military actions or military actors. And the second mode of rationalization, which is one that's a little bit more sophisticated and I think hard for people to notice in real time, although people attempted to report on it, was when the White House began to distance itself from the decisions it was making and its active involvement in the genocide by attempting to effectively third-party themselves, by framing themselves not as a participant in the genocide on the side of the country committing genocide, not as a country that was selling $2 billion in weapons, or rather not selling, giving $2 billion in weapons a week to the genocidal entity, and of course providing military support, diplomatic support at the UN, PR support, affirming bogus intelligence, but we're actually just a bumbling peacemaker seeking a ceasefire. So this was the posture that was taken. It began to be peppered in late 2023 with these White House curated stories about how upset Biden was. We can go into it, but I call it the helpless Biden trope in parallel with the fuming Biden trope. So he was simultaneously angry all the time and also helpless to do anything. And this fiction developed this mode of rationalization where you could say, as a liberal, because again, that's the key target for this, I'm really sad, I'm really upset, but Biden can't do anything even if he wanted to. Or if he wanted to, or he's about to do something, because look at this New York Times article or Axios article or Politico article or NBC News article insisting that he's actually very upset by it. And I list dozens of the examples of these articles, and they're done nonstop for about 15, maybe like 13 months, from roughly November of 2023 until pretty much the time he leaves office in January of 2025. You get dozens of articles talking about how Biden's about to so-called break with Netanyahu. And of course, he never does, because it's not real. And what's important to understand is that Michael Herzog, the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations during this time period, has since confirmed in April of 2025 that Biden never asked for a ceasefire. Those are his words. He never asked for a ceasefire. It was a fiction. It was a fiction propped up by a deliberately credulous media that needed to distance the White House from the carnage that everybody knew was indefensible and completely nihilistic and completely asymmetrical and indefensible. And so they had to keep the arms flow going and keep the military support going, but look like they weren't part of it. It's classic public relations coup. And then you pair that with the completely Orwellian reinvention of the term ceasefire in February of 2024, where the term for 5,000 years meant both sides cease firing and then pursue a political solution. It then, therefore, was rebranded as I support a ceasefire. And then you say, well, what's the definition? And it's Hamas surrender. That's a reiteration of surrender terms and a demand of capitulation that is not a call for a ceasefire, especially in the context where 99.9% of the firing and killing is done by one side, which is Israel, who, of course, has massive technological advantages. And so all those public relations interventions, all that kind of fake ceasefire theater, fake day after theater, fake angry, Biden's always fuming and upset behind closed doors, yet mysteriously never changes his policies. In the book, we compare it to in Theater 101. You learn the difference between a sketch and a plot. A plot moves forward. There's beat changes. Things happen. In a sketch, it's the same gag 3 or 4 times, and you get out in under 4 minutes. But that was so. What it was fundamentally a sketch. Biden's angry. Biden's fuming. Biden's about to break from Netanyahu. You would get this in November, December 2023, then January, then March, and then May. Peter Baker did it in May of 2024. And you would think an editor worth their salt, after the literally 30th or 40th time you see this article, would ask, well, wait, if he's upset, then why is he not doing anything? Why is there no material change in policy? never came. Largely, these White House stenographers kept printing this non-story, probably because it was easy and cheap, and really what it served their purpose, which was to distance the White House from the horrors in Gaza, which nobody wanted to defend. And so there was so much incentive, both from liberal Zionists who wanted to keep the weapons flow going while maintaining their image of humanitarian liberals. But also, as you got closer to November of 2024, increasingly people did it for partisan reasons. They didn't want Trump to come back to the White House, and they knew this issue was a loser. They knew it was killing Biden, and they knew Biden was stubborn and wasn't going to change his position. So we had to reconcile reality to comport with their needs, rather than accurately reporting reality, which is this was a genocide Biden supported openly and explicitly, because he refused. He repeatedly said he refused to ever condition aid to Israel or condition weapons to Israel. And everybody knew that conditioning weapons to Israel and military support to Israel, or the credible threat thereof, was the only way that Israel was ever going to agree to a ceasefire. And of course, ultimately, it was the only way Israel ever agreed to a ceasefire when Trump came into office. Of course, that later was, that ceasefire was broken by Israel, and then it was later reasserted. And of course, it's an imperfect ceasefire, but it shows in principle one was possible. And again, we know from Ambassador Herzog that Biden never even asked for one. So, the ceasefire talks were not ceasefire talks. The ceasefire talks were the reassertion of capitulation terms. And that alternate fiction, that kind of alternate reality, provided the necessary distance for the White House and for liberal institutions more broadly. And of course, it worked. Public relations wise, it worked. The anger and the protests, in concert with the cracking down of campus protesters and the smearing of them as anti-Semites or kind of proto-pogroms, all that together really provided the requisite space for Biden and the United States and Sullivan and Kirby and Blinken to carry out genocide until they literally 20 minutes before they left office.
Yeah, and now I wanted to ask, as you noted earlier, that the book recounts specific sort of incidents that sort of illustrate how the sort of mainstream center left media provided ideological rationalization for the genocide. And there's one in particular I wanted to talk to you about because it was such a mindfuck when it happened, and that's the Al-Ali Baptist Hospital bombing, though it was quickly just referred to as a mysterious blast in media. And I think you do a good job recounting in the book how, right away, I mean, most media outlets kind of assumed it was the Israelis who did it because they're the ones dropping the vast majority of bombs on Gaza. There were reports that 500 people were killed. Next day, the Israelis come out and say, oh, no. It was actually an errant Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PIJ, missile. And also, we don't know how many people died, but it wasn't 500. Might have been a few dozen. Tragic mistake.
Mm-hmm.
They give some audio that is thoroughly debunked by people who speak Arabic. Like, that's just not how
it's literally two guys with Israeli accents talking in Arabic. Yes.
Yeah. It's like a Borat sketch. Like, no, it's a Borat sketch. It's like, we're doing terrorism terroristically against our own people because we're evil and we just get a kick out of it. And they deployed that a few times throughout.
It was debunked by Channel 4 in Britain, but not by any in the United States. So the Al-Ali hospital bombing. Oh, sorry. Do you want
to? Just if I can frame a bit.
Sure.
Then the next day, U.S. intelligence comes out and says, and Biden says, it was PIJ missile, and we don't know how many people died, but it was like 150 to 300 or something in that realm. Like, it was hundreds of people died, but it wasn't 500. Then that's reported sort of uncritically by CNN, AP, Washington Post, critical reports, as you know, from Channel 4, Al Jazeera, and surprisingly, the New York Times. they have that digital sort of forensics team looking at the missile, the video of the missile that Israel and the
Well, they
US
debunked
claimed.
Israel's video, but affirmed that it was likely PIJ.
It was
Through
very New
other
York
reporting.
Times. It was very New York Times.
No,
I
not in that.
remember
Sorry,
they were
not in
like-
that same not in that same article, but their subsequent reporting.
right in the newsletter, I think by letter.
They repeated the U.S. government's claim that it was PIJ rocket, and David Leonard affirmed it. So so in addition to the fake phone call, Israel released that fake video, and Israel debunked the fake video. Of course, no one is bothered asking why Israel keeps releasing fake information for something they didn't do. But it very much I believe they editorially settle on a fog of war kind of avoidance, and then later they pass along the U.S. government's claim without criticism.
And that's precisely why I wanted to ask you. You talk in the book about how there were sort of two outcomes for media coverage of the genocide coming out of this. The first was, of course, what anyone who's read a news article on Gaza over the past 2.5 years knows: Hamas run health ministry affixed to every casualty count, which is intended to cast doubt. And then also, and this I think might not be as apparent to your average news consumer, is not reporting on Israeli attacks unless the Israelis confirm that was them.
Well, you're not attributing it to Israel. Right. So let's talk about that, because I argue that the Al-Ali hospital bombing was the most critical moment of the genocide. It was really where something that could have marshaled opposition and ended the genocide, because at that point they'd already killed 5,000-6,000 people. They had really, an obscene amount of people had been killed in the first 10 days. Unprecedented level of carnage and mass killing. And of course, as you remember, when the hospital was bombed, now just to clarify here, PIJ and Hamas have fired, of course, thousands and thousands of rockets in Israel. 1,500 have landed in Israel and killed a total of 12 people. So if one wants to think one errant PIJ bomb killed 350 people, they're welcome to believe that.
Where do you get the 350 number from? Because I noticed in the book.
Well, because the Israeli number is, rather the Palestinian number is, I believe, 400, and the U.S. number is, I think, 150 to 300. So I'm sort of splitting the difference.
Oh, okay, yeah. Because
I'm splitting the difference to sort of. The point is, hundreds of people were killed, right?
Yeah.
That seems very unlikely to me. Forensic architecture published several lies that Israel told. I don't think you generally lie that much about something for which you have no responsibility. Of course, they had to say it was PIJ because PIJ is the only one with access to Iranian provided rockets. That's why it was conveniently PIJ.
Oh, and not Hamas.
Yes, because Hamas's rockets are generally not as strong. That's why they have way more of them, but they're not nearly as
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
So I think it's clear it was Israeli shelling. I don't think it was an airstrike, but I think it was definitely a shell. But that aside, it fell into this fog of war. And so what happened was you had this cry-bully campaign from these Zionist pressure groups like Camera, Honest Reporting, the Anti-Defamation League first and foremost, that basically accused New York Times and CNN, who, like you mentioned, initially had blamed Israel because they're dropping 99.9999% of the bombs. And so the standard of editorial standard historically was you blame the most likely person. But they even said, according to Gaza officials, the headline I think in the New York Times was airstrike on hospital, kills hundreds, according to Gaza officials. And this was blood libel to Jonathan Greenblatt and company. And then, so not only was it not a moment we could coalesce and end this, because if you recall, there were riots in various cities, there were attacks on consulates, people were genuinely outraged by this. There was that famous news conference where there was all the dead bodies and children. It was just unbelievable, like a hellish images. And, but the opposite happened. What happened was this was turned into a media mistake, or a media that was too reliant on quote unquote terrorist propaganda. And then two policy changes were instituted at the New York Times and CNN, and almost certainly elsewhere, but the New York Times and CNN are the ones we have firsthand accounts for, based on reporting in The Intercept and my own sourcing. The first, as you mentioned, was the introduction of the pejorative Hamas-run health ministry. So what's important to understand is that the label Hamas-run, before you mentioned the Gaza health ministry, had never been written in the New York Times from October 7th to October 17th. It had not been mentioned on any cable news networks from October 7th to October 17th. It was purely a response to that pseudo scandal that was ginned up by these Zionist cry-bully groups. And then after that, you see a massive explosion. It's used at the New York Times. It's used at the AP. It's used at CNN, MSNBC, this pejorative Hamas-run health ministry. And the reason for that is obvious, because the body counts, daily body counts were 400, 500. There was even one day in late October that was 1,000 people were being killed a day. And they knew that this was going to be a PR problem for obvious reasons, because this is unprecedented level of carnage. So what they did is they said, if you introduce the according to the Hamas run, it necessarily dulls the kind of liberal outrage, which was the objective. The second thing they needed to do to dull liberal outrage, they being the Zionist crybaby organizations and their allies within these media organizations, as you also mentioned, was to you were not allowed to attribute responsibility to Israel, and that we know for sure this was policy at the New York Times, and we know for certain this was policy at CNN. After the Al-Ali hospital bombing, editors and producers were no longer allowed to attribute responsibility to Israel unless the IDF affirmed it or independently confirmed it themselves. So this is an unprecedented editorial standard that had not existed prior to October 17th and has not existed anywhere else in any other war zone, certainly not in Ukraine or anywhere else. And I asked a CNN source about this. I said, have you seen this anywhere else? Because he had worked in several war zones. He says, never, 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 never. I think he gave 5 nevers. You'd never seen it before.
Yeah, I remember.
And what this does is it meaningfully impacts the visceral response to these horrific headlines. Because obviously Israel strikes a refugee camp and kills 50 is going to have a different impact than explosion in refugee camp kills 50. And that's precisely what you get for the next few months. You get this constant torrent, as we document, I think, quite rigorously and non-arbitrarily, because we look at the front page headlines of the New York Times print edition. You get these mysterious blasts and explosions that come out of nowhere, that have no authorship and no agency. And this really and you compare it to how they cover Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it's night and day. Russia Russia bombs maternity ward. Russia attacks Kiev. So Russia has agency. Everything that happens in Gaza is treated like a natural disaster. It's stripped of agency as a structural editorial choice, because Israel is simply not going to affirm its responsibility for anything that has causes PR problems, and to the extent to which they do, it's weeks or months later where it doesn't really matter anymore. And you see these uniformly across every major media outlet, and again, they were done by internal editorial decisions. Because that was their way of, it's kind of classic liberal propaganda in that it's technically accurate to say Hamas-run health ministry, but it's wildly misleading, because everyone who knows anything about Gaza knows that the so-called Hamas-run health ministry statistics have a history of being very, very accurate, if not a major undercount. They had been used by Human Rights Watch, by the U.S. State Department, by the World Health Organization, and then we later learned by Mossad. And in fact, there was a study in 2014 done. There was a study after the 2014 bombing of Protective Edge that compared the IDF's civilian death total with that of the Hamas-controlled health ministry, and found that they were off by about 7%. So, and this, of course, doesn't include people under rubble or people who die of preventable disease, which almost certainly numbers in the tens of thousands. And so it's a massive undercount anyway. But they know that the average consumer is not going to know that. They're just going to hear Hamas run and think, oh, this is just terrorist propaganda. And internally, we know from several sources, and this has, I think, been touched on elsewhere, everybody who worked at these organizations who valued themselves as journalists knew this was bullshit. They knew it was a racist watchword that was meant to trivialize and operate as genocide denial. And then you notice it eventually starts to go away. After it serves its initial function in late 2024 and into 2025, it's used less and less by media outlets, because it served its function, which was to dull liberal outrage in the initial first months of the genocide. And just the same, you start to see more sensible attribution in some outlets, although not the New York Times, where they would say, clearly this was an Israeli strike. We can't just sit around and wait for the IDF to do our work for us. And those two interventions were, I think, critical to really ameliorating the liberal outrage that would have been necessary to end the genocide in its early months.
Yeah, and I mean, it's worth noting in the context of Hamas-run health ministry that Israel's health ministry is run by Shas, an ultra-Orthodox theocratic political party. Right. Yet, as you note in the book, when it came to October 7th, I mean, the Israelis literally revised their casualty figure.
Well, that's another thing. They kept saying, because the Al-Ali hospital casualty figures were revised down, that this was evidence. There was always some whiff of conspiracy. The Atlantic magazine did this. They were like, oh, why did it go from 500 to 300? And it's like, but that's normal, because you're counting body parts. and their initial estimates. And of course, again, October 7th went from 1,500 to 1,400 to 1,200. I think eventually settled on a 1,129, give or take, depending how you define who died that day. And of course, September 11th was initially 10,000. That was the estimate. So like this is normal. It's more normal stuff in horrific war zones with limited resources, but it kept being, again, in October 17th, 18th, and 19th, there would be these like interventions where liberal publications say, guys, we got this one wrong. We really bought into Hamas propaganda. I mean, it was absurd, the kind of pseudo self-flagellating, because it was all there to provide a permission structure for genocide denial, which is ultimately what it did. But yeah, revising figures down is complete 101 protocol. It's what everyone does. But again, everything has to have this whiff of Hamas conspiracyism, because they can't quite make the case that it's somehow untoward or unusual. So they just kind of do this. They do a lot of innuendo, which is pretty much, again, 90% of the lurid schlock that comes out of the pro-Israel media.
We've been talking mostly about the reporting that the mainstream media does in Gaza, but in the book, you also name names and criticize the pundits who were much more overt in their efforts to build support for this war. Joe Scarborough, or Morning Joe at MSNBC, Jake Tapper and Dana Bash at CNN, David Leonard at the New York Times, and Clown Car of Atlantic essayists. What role did commentary play on top of this skewed reporting that you've outlined in selling the genocide?
Well, commentary really works backwards from the premise of this genocide is necessary, and is, again, they wouldn't call it that themselves. This quote unquote war on Hamas is necessary and righteous and good. But liberals are obviously very squeamish about it. So I need to provide reasons for why they don't need to care. And so that's where you get helpless Biden, fuming Biden, right? It's a PR 101. If you can't win an argument, you make it a non sequitur. And they couldn't win the argument, so they kept indulging in this kind of mystification of a ceasefire. What is a ceasefire? Who's to say? I mean, you had these kind of hand-wringing articles in The Atlantic by Graham Wood. And then Graham Wood would argued against a ceasefire. And then literally 6 weeks later in The Atlantic, he would say, oh, Hamas doesn't want one. And it's like, well, why don't you mention that you don't want one? You argued 6 weeks ago. So you had this kind of highbrow, fart-sniffing mystification of all these concepts just to buy time. This is a story about buying time. And then, of course, you had what I call the move along, nothing to see here genre that The Atlantic had. Yair Rosenberg wrote two of these, where you would take these obviously genocidal statements by Israeli figures, whether it was Yoav Gallant's human animals line, how they're going to cut off food aid, fuel, whether it was Benjamin Netanyahu's Amlak speech, whether it was President Isaac Herzog's no innocence in Gaza, although he conveniently ignores that one because that one was in English. So he couldn't try to, you don't understand Hebrew, was his kind of go-to posture. And then he would take these articles on genocidal statements and say, actually, he's not calling Palestinians human animals. He's saying that Hamas is human animals, which, if anyone knows anything about the Rwandan genocide, was the exact argument used in the International Court for Genocide in Rwanda. So and then of course he says, oh, he's not talking about the genocidal reference to Amlak. He's actually referencing a different book in the Bible. So it's the non-genocidal reference to Amlak, as if there's no such thing as subtext or context.
As if Netanyahu is a Talmudic scholar.
As if he's a simple country Talmudic scholar, right? And so you got this mystifying bullshit all the time, and it really they didn't. What you notice is how half-assed they are. They don't actually put a lot of work in them. They're really very short. They're just kind of things you could pass along social media to your liberal friends and say, actually, these statements aren't genocidal. Look at this piece they wrote in the Atlantic. Then the New York Times had their own intervention finally in November of 2023, because you had to address the obscenely genocidal statements being made by Israelis because they were going viral on social media all the time. And then they don't interview any Palestinians. They don't interview any genocide scholars. They don't even use the word genocide. They simply interview Israelis and give a bunch of psychobabble about how they're basically just blowing off steam because they're so traumatized by October 7th, and that they don't really mean it. It's kind of just locker room talk. Now, of course, everything they promised they would do, from forcing them to live in tents, to mass killing, to mass starvation, to treating them like animals, is literally what they did. They killed, again, 75,000, almost certainly double that. Every single genocidal statement they made, they fulfilled. with the exception perhaps of full displacement, because they didn't have the ability to do that because people were shooting back and there was so much political pressure not to do that. But certainly they tried. And that was simply hand waved away by these professional kind of liberal Zionist laundromats, where they take these horrific things that are happening in the actual state of Israel that actually exist in reality, and then they take it into this kind of abstract, and then it comes out the other end, and it's this war on Hamas. You would see this hunt for Hamas phrasing used in the Washington Post, as if it was like this zero dark 30, kind of targeted boutique artisanal. I mean, and that was just not what was happening. It was not what was happening on Israeli television. It was not what was happening based on their statements. It was not what was happening based on what you saw from the images coming out of Palestine. It was mass slaughter and mass killing. But as long as they had this thin veil of military targets or military aims, they could kill as many people as they wanted, as many civilians as they wanted. And indeed, 3% of the people who died on October 7th were children, but roughly 30% of the people who died in the military response, quote unquote, in Gaza were children. So at a factor of 10x. But mysteriously, that is a targeted military operation. The former is mindless, sadistic violence for its own sake. So, all of these things were out in the open, but they were not talked about. In this we still see this. This is why Nicholas Kristof talking about Palestinian rape or rape of Palestinians in Israeli prisons, despite its kind of framing flaws, was such a huge outrage, because this has already been discussed in Haaretz. It's discussed in Israeli media, but it can't break containment. Same thing with the Hannibal Directive, which I actually don't talk about in my book, but like people do not talk about that in American media because it seems like you're a conspiracy theorist, but it's openly discussed on Israeli TV. It's talked about in Haaretz, but things aren't allowed to break containment that disrupt this kind of simple and pat narrative. And you would see this over and over and over again, where overtly genocidal statements that are interpreted as genocidal in Israeli media and Israeli society, and even criticized as such in the so-called left-wing press within Israel, are just not talked about. And the extent to which they are touched on, they are hand-waved away, and you get the move along, nothing to see here.
Yeah. I mean, the question with Hannibal Directive is to what extent
we don't know. That's the thing.
Right. And
I mean, one of the reasons I don't talk about it, one of the reasons I don't mention it is I do think it kind of gets you into a back and forth where it says, well, they wouldn't have killed them had they not, began attacking them, which is true. But it's like, just as a matter of posterity and knowing what happened, it would be nice to know to what extent. Because again, the sheer level of, we'll never know, but I think we can all agree that the sheer level of carnage was probably not possible given the capacity of the fighters, despite the fact that there were many of them. There were several thousands of them. But and so I think some people view it as like offsetting responsibility, but that's not really the point. The point is, like, if you're going to hang your hat on these horrific death figures, we need to be honest about how that was arrived at.
All right. I know you got to run. Last question. In the book, you talk to a source of yours at MSNBC. What I guess is MS Now.
Yes, it's MS Now.
Yeah. Who you're paraphrasing them, but you write that there were seemingly ideologically neutral rules against veering too far into editorializing the conflict. But this was a prohibition only enforced in one direction. And I guess to conclude, what does that tell us about American mainstream media writ large?
I think it says a lot about liberalism as a concept and small L liberalism and liberal institutions, which is, you can't just say I'm an imperialist, I'm a Zionist, I think Palestinians don't deserve the land, because that's tacky. So you have to launder your imperialism through ostensibly universalist claims. And that's why you have to build these rather goofy and inconsistent ontologies like terrorism to exceptionalize certain violence while defending others. And so what you see is this was October of 2023 was, for want of a better term, the kind of peak woke 1.0. So everyone was sort of ostensibly fighting for social justice and fighting racism and fighting misogyny and all. And so, of course, you had Russia's invasion the year prior, where every liberal institution stood up for Ukraine and opposed Russian aggression. You go to the opera or the theater or the symphony, and they do a whole thing about Ukraine, put the Ukrainian flag, and how they banished all Russian. It was sort of this liberal thing. We were like, caring was, even in professional journalists, was considered in vogue. It was kind of a thing you did. And then mysteriously, in November and December of 2023, all that went away. Not only were they not taking a firm stance against genocide or supporting a ceasefire, because they couldn't just say we support Israel, because again, they're supposed to be on the side of justice, and everyone can see how unjust this is. So what do? They don't say, they do the next best thing, which is, oh, we actually are for neutrality. We oppose politics as such. So we documented the top 25 colleges, according to U.S. News and World Report. 12 of them in late 2023 and early 2024 introduced neutrality pledges out of nowhere, mysteriously, just coincidentally, because they were getting so much pressure to support a ceasefire, and they couldn't defend not doing that. They couldn't just say we support Zionism. We have a lot of pro-Israel donors, so fuck off, because that's tacky. That's illiberal. So then they have to invent an ostensibly liberal reason for why they support Israel. And journalists were institutions and media outlets operated under similar dynamics, where they couldn't say we're going to discipline you if you're pro-Palestine because we support Israel. Again, that's gauche. You can't do that. So we ostensibly have these rules against having editorial preferences or social media posts, but we literally only enforce them against pro-Palestine employees. And meanwhile, you can publish or post or retweet the most genocidal stuff imaginable, and you're not disciplined. And because MSNBC has still has a policy against anchors overtly editorializing on the Gaza issue. They were told not to do that. They said they had to have some semblance of balance. And that just didn't apply to Joe Scarborough, because he was so pro-Israel, it didn't matter. Meanwhile, anyone who tries to provide context, as I discuss in detail, or even provide a reason for why October 7th would happen, were severely disciplined, demoted, and in some cases, I think, pushed out. And so, because again, management, and this is kind of true for HR reasons too, and frankly, they used racism as a proxy for a lot of this too. They sort of just, anyone who was Muslim or Arab or even South Asian or like vaguely coded as such were just removed from the Gaza beat altogether. But they would hyper police social media activity of people who were sympathetic to Palestine. So you had instances where the most milquetoast, generic, like bring in humanitarian aid to Palestine type comments, and we document this in the book, get people fired. You have employees snitching on their coworkers who are viewed as being insufficiently pro-Israel. And of course, you have management making it very clear, because people, you go to pitch meetings and you pitch a story about Palestine and they would say, we'll look into it, never get back to you. It became very clear, very obvious what the guardrails were and what you weren't allowed to say very quickly. And the way that was enforced was through this kind of faux editorial independence, or rather kind of faux editorial neutrality. But only one side is supposed to be neutral, and the other side can be as ideological as they wish.
Adam, thanks so much for joining me. This was a real honor. I look up to you a lot, and your work has greatly influenced me as an aspiring media critic.
All right.
So thank you for everything you do. The book's great. Where can people find it?
Pluto Press, but you can find it in any bookstore. It's in Barnes and Noble. It's on the Evil website. You can buy it there too. It's not fringe. It should be easy to find, but definitely How to Sell Genocide. You can look it up and buy it. And I should say 100% of the royalties do go to the Middle East Children's Alliance, which helps refugees in Palestine and Lebanon.
All right. Take care, Adam.
Right, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.